We are so fortunate today to have an amazing keynote speaker. But unfortunately, it's not my pleasure to be able to introduce her. And I thought, I was going to get to do that, but now reading who is going to be able to do that, I'm excited for the group. She is a lawyer with Davis, Wright, and Tremaine. I hope I said that correctly. It's Miss Rochelle Wilcox. So if I could ask her to join up here, and she can introduce the Chief Justice.
Hi, everybody. I have the truly great honor of introducing the Chief Justice of the State of California, the Honorable Tani Cantil-Sakauye. Chief Justice Cantil-Sakauye is one of 4 women on the 7-member California Supreme Court, many of whom overcame adversity to succeed. Her parents both worked in the fields in Hawaii. She didn't even consider becoming a lawyer until speech and debate classes in college, and worked as a waitress to pay her way through college and law school. I've heard rumors that she also dealt cards part of the time that she was in law school. She was admitted to the California Bar in December 1984 after working in the District Attorney's Office in Sacramento and on staff in Governor Deukmejian's office. She was appointed to the bench. She served more than 20 years on California's trial and appellate courts, including 6 on the Court of Appeal in the 3rd Appellate District in Sacramento. Chief Justice Cantil-Sakauye was nominated to be California's Chief Justice in July 2010, unanimously confirmed in August 2010, and overwhelmingly approved by the voters in the November 2010 general election. She was sworn in as the Chief Justice of the State of California on January 3rd, 2011, and is the first Asian Filipina American and the 2nd woman to serve as California's Chief Justice. The Chief Justice has stated that her initiatives are guided by her vision for Access 3D, a 3-dimensional access to our judicial system: physical, remote, and equal. This means safe and secure courthouses open for the people's business, effective use of technology to efficiently expand hours and compress distances, and the removal of barriers that might prevent any Californian from accessing the court system. She's transformed the Judicial Council by making changes intended to enhance efficiencies, but more importantly, for the purposes of this audience, opening the previously closed council meetings to the public and allowing for public comment. The rules that govern the council now guarantee public access to advisory committee meetings. Those meetings, as well as the California Supreme Court arguments, are all now live streamed. As one of her initiatives designed to improve the lives of children in California, she has championed civic engagement and civic learning as primary goals of her term. She launched the Power of Democracy initiative to promote civics literacy in California schools. Along with the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chief Justice Cantil-Sakauye annually presents the Civic Learning Award to schools with model civic education programs. The Chief Justice also has not been afraid to use her platform to advocate on behalf of everyone in our country and the importance of protecting constitutional rights and norms. In an address to the joint session of the legislature in March of this year, she proclaimed that our values, practices, and laws are being called into question, and all 3 branches of government and the free press are in the crosshairs. She explained that the rule of law is being threatened. We are living in a time of civic rights unrest, eroding trust in our institutions, economic anxiety, and unprecedented polarization. Earlier this year, she demonstrated her fearless commitment to the guarantees of access to all of California's courtrooms for everyone living in the state when she challenged the Trump administration's enforcement actions in California courtrooms. And this is an issue that I'll ask her about in a moment. Please join me in welcoming the Chief Justice of the State of California, the Honorable Tani Cantil-Sakauye. Thank you again for being here. My introduction mentioned your childhood, and I think one of the most impressive things about you is the path you took to reach the California Supreme Court. Can you tell us a little bit about growing up with parents who both had to work so hard to raise a family, and how it's influenced your path to law school and eventually to the bench?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for educating the public, for engaging our dialogue, for being at our dinner tables every night and in our conversations. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. I grew up in a family of immigrants and a community of immigrants, Filipinos, who came from large families because you wanted large families to work the fields. So on my mother's side, all my aunts and uncles were born in different delta towns along the Sacramento River associated with certain crops, like cutting asparagus, picking pears, picking tomatoes. And so I grew up in that environment and did the same. My father was in Hawaii and he cut sugar cane. And so when they came together and started to have their children, the greatest issue for them was what they didn't have. And what they didn't have was an education. My father had a second grade education, and my mother finished community college at the same time my sister, who's 5 years older than I am, also finished community college. So they graduated together. So I always knew education was important. And my parents always instilled, of course, like your parents, hard work, and belief in the American dream, that if you worked hard and you showed up every day, that you'd have opportunities. And sure enough, that was true. But I also attribute the road to law from mentors. And of course, there weren't very many Filipina mentors in school or along the way, but I learned it from visionary people, very judges and men and lawyers who just saw the world of California changing and who encouraged me to go to school and who encouraged me to try things I didn't know I could do. So I'm thankful for one particularly great professor from my community college who's now passed away, Ken Lynch, who really said you need to try things. You're only 18. How can you know what you don't know? And along the way, the lawyers who fought me, the lawyers who tried their psych games out on me, the joy in fighting them, the joy in beating them, the joy in insulting them, which in a friendly way, we're friends, but when it came time to trying cases, when I was an attorney, it was no holds barred. And I was fortunate to go to the bench thereafter.
You've talked publicly about some of your childhood experiences, a lost home, a visit to a lawyer, a family marriage that had to occur in another state. Can you discuss these or other experiences you had as a child or young adult and how they shaped your views of society and ultimately influenced your judicial philosophy?
Thank you. Well, as you can imagine, like you, all things that happen in your home have a profound effect on you, and it doesn't really play out until you get older and understand aspects of it. So up until the age of 9, my family lived in a home in an alley in downtown Sacramento. And I also now come to realize we lived next to a brothel. But I was young enough not to know that. I just saw the traffic and didn't think much of that. We had a big fence, and I played behind the fence. And then I learned that our home was being taken away. And my grandmother lived in a home next to me. And all I remember up until that point, until I was 9 years old, is that government was taking our home away and making us move. And so my mother, she went in pro per to fight the eminent domain action in court. And my mother, who's alive today, didn't know what she was doing, just felt the injustice of it. And she came back humiliated. That's what I remember. I'm 9 years old, my mother comes home, and no one has ever, in my eyes, ever humiliated my mother. And I see her emotional reaction, and I don't know what it means, except now we're moving, now there's a lot of fighting, now we have a certain date, the house is going to be torn down, grandma can't live with us, our family is divided. And so those kinds of experiences with additional, my Filipino uncle had to move out of state to marry his French wife. So when you hear that as a child, you think, that's odd. And it slowly starts to accumulate, and you begin to realize that we have no control. Someone else is calling the tune, and we're reacting, and we're angry about it, but we're dancing the tune. And so that's what I remember in my environment of growing up, of just not understanding what was going on.
And how do you think that's influenced you now on the bench, and kind of how you approach cases and how you interact with the cases and the people that are appearing before you?
It's very important for me to understand the dynamics. It may be that you think that at the Supreme Court level, when we're applying the rule of law or clarifying a rule of law, at the appellate level, that the facts are not as important. But for me, the facts are very important. I need to understand the mosaic in which we're working in. I need to understand the motivation. I want to know why this lawsuit was brought. It might be obvious to some, but I want to dig and know what is the human motivation behind this. It helps me understand the strategy thereafter. It helps me understand the rule of law we're applying. It helps me to be able to explain it. If someone's losing on our case, I'd like to explain it when I think that they may not understand what we're doing. So I think what my life as a child has done is help me try to understand better the positions of the parties and the human motivations behind it, and then to explain it in a way that doesn't make it menacing or shocking or overtly harsh, so that people begin to understand that the rule of law is to be applied fairly and equally, and we all have access to it. And we may have different ideas about what justice looks like at the end of the day, but I want to ensure there's a fair process and that you feel honored in the process and that you feel heard in the process and that you were treated just like everyone else in the process, but no worse, no better.
Thank you. I talked a little bit in the introduction about your commitment to education for children and civics education. Is there anything in particular in your background that inspired you to be such a fierce advocate for equal access to justice and kids and civic education?
Well, I'll start backwards, and that is I became a fierce advocate of civics more so because in my first year as Chief Justice and I went to the Capitol, no one knew who the judiciary was. They thought I was a department of the governor's branch, of the executive branch. And then it was expressed to me that some people wanted all the judges to work for me and for me to work for the legislature. And I thought to myself, do you have no understanding of the separation of powers? Have you never heard of checks and balances? Have you never heard of the rule of law and the different roles we play? And I found it over and over again, and I'm in the Capitol trying to ensure that the branch gets adequate funding. But I can't even really get to that argument because they think I should work for them and the judges should work for me. So I'm regaled with tales of a bad divorce. I'm regaled with tales of a bad judge. And I think to myself, all good and well, we can disagree, but I really need you to understand the judicial branch and what we do. And that led me to look back at the judiciary and pick up one of our civics initiatives and develop it to where we now are very active in teaching civics in K through 12 and also at the adult level.
And this was legislators and people working in the legislative office that
yes, and
wow.
staff. I mean, these are a lawyer said that to me. And so I knew I was in deep trouble and had to start right away.
And can you talk to us a little bit about the role of the media, both the mainstream media and also citizen journalists and others who are active in social media on civic engagement?
Well, I am pleased to always speak to our students who win the awards and at the schools about the importance of the media, because you bring the stories, you bring the facts to the attention of all of us. And then it's from your fact and the stories you write, the stories you publish, that I try to engage them in critical thought about the positions that people have in the paper, why and what may be their motivations, what's the end result. So it's really your work that starts the conversation and starts the critical thinking and starts students and young leaders to think about the world they're in. Without your reporting, we would not know what's going on. And so while we may have different opinions about a report or a paper or an article or a slant, alleged slant, the point is it's still important and worth having. And I worry that media will be somehow edited or censored or not available. And that's how we get our information. It's the first thing I talk about every Wednesday when the justices come to my chamber. We discuss cases for the next 2 hours. We talk about what's in the media. We talk about who wrote it. We talk about their information. We talk about other articles covering it. We are all media addicts. And every lawyer, every judge I know just about is a media news addict. We are reading you. We're talking about you. We are following you.
What should the people in this room be doing differently to improve civic education and improve participation in democracy?
Well, I think right now, just by virtue of doing your work and putting it out there and explaining motivations. And for me, I like longer articles. I think it's important to describe the backgrounds of the people who you're getting quotes from. It gives us an understanding of, like I look at facts, what are the motivations of the actors? And what's the result that they want? Sometimes it's important to know, what do they really want? So with your inquisitive questions, we can get to what their motivation is, which gives us an understanding of the world around us.
And what about kind of outside of traditional journalism, and as you look at social media, how do you see that playing in, in society today, and what can or should it be doing differently, or how can it contribute better to the need that we have for civic education and just a better democracy and understanding of democracy?
Well, I think, I will confess to being not the most adept at social media. I like a newspaper. I like to read the articles. I don't like little tasty sound bites repeated in BuzzFeed. I don't trust that news. I want to go to the source, and I realize that you are doing the work and someone else is copying your work, and they may be editing it or they may be abbreviating it. And I don't want to read it that way. But I realize that that's how probably everyone under 45 or at least under 30, that's how they get their news. So that's the reality. They're getting it on their phone, they're getting it in an abbreviation, they're not opening up the full article, they're reading the headline, they might be reading the first 3 sentences, then they talk about it with friends or colleagues, and then that becomes the narrative without anybody fully reading to the end. So I'm not a great fan of social media, but I realize that it is the norm. And it's not the norm in the circles I run. My daughter's here. They read their news off of BuzzFeed. I said, would you please download something else to confirm that material?
Always good advice. I want to shift to something I mentioned in the introduction, the letter that you wrote to the Trump administration in connection with courthouses and detaining undocumented immigrants in courthouses. And I was, like many Californians, proud to see you take that stand. They responded, from what I understand, by declaring their intent to continue making such arrests, and stating that ICE officers and agents will remain mindful of concerns regarding enforcement activities. It's a little unusual to see a member of the judiciary speak out so directly on an issue like that. Have you done anything like that before?
Absolutely not. And I'll say that when I decided to do it, it was after having read, thank you, in the newspapers, thank you, about different enforcement arrests in immigration in other states. And so I belong to the Conference of Chief Justices, and I know the chiefs in those states, and I thought, well, they're going to speak up. I'm going to hear something from them. They're going to send an email blast, and they're going to say, this is happening. Shouldn't we do something? And it never came, and it never came, and it never came. And so when it happened in California at the Pasadena courthouse, and I had heard then different stories from judges in California, that's when I decided, I called in my staff and I said, I want to write a letter. And they looked at me like, you want a what? And I said, well, everyone writes me letters, believe me. Everyone tells me how the court can run better, everyone. And so some I answer and some I don't, and some I farm out to others to answer. So I thought I'd send a letter. And I was surprised they wrote me back. I did not expect to receive the reaction, both positive and negative. I did not expect that many people out of state would call in and leave messages on our public line. And it turned into a dialogue. And so thereafter, as you know, the Chief Justice of Washington and the Chief Justice of Oregon and the Chief Justice of New Jersey also wrote letters. And then I started receiving calls from members of not the judicial branch, but the executive branch in other states who wanted to know if I could join them on different aspects of immigration. And I said, no, I can't. I'm just the Chief Justice of California, and I'm only writing about the access to justice issue in California. And so I'm not political. I'm not going to weigh in on sanctuary cities. I'm telling you only about access to justice in the judicial branch should not be trenched upon by executive acts that destroy our public trust and confidence. But I will give you information if you need it, but I've tried to draw back from it because I don't mean it to be political in the sense that that's been some of the narrative.
Sure. You chose strong language. You referred to stalking. Can you talk to us about your decision to use such strong language, and then whether or not you've actually heard of any effects from your letter on the ground and in courthouses in California?
Absolutely. Well, about over 10 years ago, I used to run the first ever domestic violence court in Sacramento. So I helped create it, and I ran it for 2.5 years. And I only dealt with domestic violence and stalking and violations of restraining orders. And so when I said stalking, I meant stalking. And I said it because, based on the reports that I had received from judges in California, that was the behavior. The behavior was intimidating. The behavior was a showing of force. The behavior was wearing a big ice jacket or parking an ice van out in front of the court for all to see. It was the concern that just by being in the courthouse, people felt threatened because there were no regulations, there was no court process for explaining this, because we're a state court and that was a federal court action. And so I used that language in part to get the attention also of the AG and the Secretary of Homeland. But I didn't realize that it would have the kind of effect it did, where they decided to write me back and help define stalking for me. And I say to myself, well, you know, I'm a big girl. I've been in the courts for 33 years. You can scold me all you want, but it doesn't throw me off of my point. So when I had an opportunity, when the Washington Post called and said, would you like to write an op-ed to clarify your position? At first I thought I probably should just end the conversation here. And then I thought, no, I think I'd like to clarify it. And so I wrote to clarify my letter. And so since then, let me say, there's been a lot of great discussions in our courts about what our authority is and what it isn't, and soft approaches that we could take to ensure that people are no longer afraid, or to ensure that if there are enforcement arrests in our courts, that it doesn't, for example, empty out an entire room of family law litigants. So it doesn't have this toxic effect that if there is immigration in the courts and there's enforcement, then there are ways to effectuate that doesn't disturb and scare everyone else there. So we've talked about that. We have shared a legal opinion with our judges about our jurisdiction in the courtrooms and our jurisdiction in the halls. We've been asked to have that people, other states have asked for that information. We are working with other states and talking with them. And so since that letter, and since our more heightened reaction and awareness, there have not been any more reports to me about this happening. And I'm gratified, frankly, to hear that. In some respects, people now are aware of their rights. They're careful. They are asking for warrants. They are in a place where they're more aware, and I'm hearing that it's not happening. And I have very good conversations and communication with the judges. So maybe it's a lull. Maybe they're gearing up. Maybe there's some discussion going on.
That sounds like a good result. I understand that during your first year as a Chief Justice, you traveled 30,000 miles to meet with community and business groups, students, elected officials, judges, and lawyers, leading to the creation of the Open Courts Coalition to advocate on behalf of public access to the courts. A San Francisco Bar publication discussed a few of the personal stories that led to this coalition, including, tragically, a Los Angeles man who successfully fought a wrongful eviction with the help of pro bono lawyers, but died sleeping outside waiting for the order to be processed. Can you tell us a little bit about this or other things that you may have learned in your outreach efforts, and describe the participants' goals and work of the Open Courts Coalition?
Thank you. Yes, when I became Chief Justice and I learned what the budget was, and I learned that we were in free fall, and that Department of Finance and the Governor's Office did not know or have any projection of when the recession would end, I knew I needed to enlist advocates. And judges cannot necessarily be advocates for themselves, and many felt uncomfortable being in the Capitol doing so. So I created a group of us, and we went north, and we went south, and we went central, and we invited lawyers and attorney groups and legal aid groups to hear what we had to say about, this is the California Judicial Branch budget. This is how it's created. This is how much money we have. We are in dire straits. We are rationing rations. And so thankfully, a number of lawyers all throughout the state stepped up and said, we want to assist in some way. We're going to staff a group of volunteers. We're calling ourselves the Open Courts Coalition because we intend to keep courts open. That's our only goal. And this was plaintiffs' lawyers, defense lawyers, it was prosecutors, it was DAs. It didn't matter your discipline because every attorney knew the value and importance of keeping courthouses open. So they went to the Capitol and they educated legislators, and they are campaign contributors, and they went to the district and they called on friends, and some of them had been contributors to Governor Brown's campaign, and they called him up, and over again they were advocates for keeping the courts open. And it's true, when an issue came up that was otherwise divisive, they would not advocate for that. But for open courts, they came together, and they've been now in existence for about 5 years. And as a result, whenever I walk into the legislature now, the first thing the member will say to me is, I know you're underfunded. I know we need to get you money. So we're really in a different place, and we've had now about $620 million restored in our budget since about 2013.
Are there other stories that you can share with the media to suggest areas that they might be focused on in helping the courts ensure that they have the right funding and advocating on behalf of the courts?
I'd be happy to, and I would say in your county or in the city in which you do the majority of your work, in the courthouses there, you will see that courthouses are now really different from what they were when I started 20 years ago. Your courthouse litigant is not an attorney with a briefcase. Your courthouse litigant is a small business owner, like a painter, who's representing himself because he can't afford an attorney. And he's coming to fight a contractual suit, or he's coming to do a small claims action, or he's coming for jury selection, or he's coming for something having to do with maybe his daughter and a car theft. So I'm telling you that the population in the California courts today are real people with real problems who don't have attorneys. We are just not seeing that population of big law anymore, really, in the courts, except if it's unless it's mass tort, because of arbitration agreements that take the litigation out of the courts, and because of private judging that takes the litigation out of the courts and away from a rule of law and away from public scrutiny and to private agreements that we have no access to. We're seeing a whole different population in the courts. They are families, they are small business, they are families with children, they are individuals. And so when I go to the governor and to the legislature, I say, courts have changed. We have really needy people in the courts. They can't afford attorneys. We're trying to provide services, not just legal services and educational services, but courts now are centers for social services. We have courts that bring together people who need alcohol counseling, who need parenting classes, who need to know how to get their GED. Courts are now, especially with our collaborative courts, our problem-solving courts, that's what we provide. We provide that. We connect the people up. So when you talk about providing money for the courts, we're not talking about judges' salaries. We're talking about staff where we need them, paying staff a responsible wage. We're talking about ensuring staff has health care so they can continue to provide the work that's important to what we do. And it's services to people, regular, everyday people who are not going to mediation and arbitration. That's where the money goes. That's what we need. Since I became chief in 2011, more than 6,000 new laws have been passed. And so where do you think those are enforced? They come directly to the courts. And I'm not even talking about initiatives, of which now we have at least 3 at the California Supreme Court that have trickled up through the trial courts. We have additional caseloads. We have additional burdens associated with those caseloads, new laws. But we have not grown in base funding. The $600 million that I mentioned earlier, that's restored from cuts. But we are now at the funding level where we were in 07-08. That's the funding level of the judicial branch today, with all of our filings, with 210 different languages spoken in our courts today. We need interpreters and we need translators, but we can't pay them enough. Federal court pays interpreters and translators far more than the trial courts do. And so as a result, we don't have enough interpreters and translators. We continue to be flat We continue to lose ground, and yet we don't get the kind of funding that was ever first taken away or even adjusted for what we should have in 2017-18.
Wow. We've talked about civics education, but you've also done impressive work to advance education and ensure that all students have an opportunity to thrive in California schools. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've done in that area and where you see problems and what you think we need to do to fix them?
Thank you. I have an initiative called Keeping Kids in School. We call it KKISS. And the reason we have this Keeping Kids in School initiative is because I learned early on in about 2011 that if a child can't read by the age of 2 or 3, or by second or third grade, we know, statistics show high probability of entering prisons. And we also know that a child who's truant, who's absent from class, has 3 times more opportunity to get into juvenile justice, the juvenile justice system. And then we know that that's then just a little gateway to the criminal adult prison system. So we know that suspending children is not the answer. It's not the answer for truancy. It makes no sense that if someone's truant that you now suspend them. And we also realize if they're truant, especially at the elementary level, probably a parent has some control over that. So, but we're punishing the student. And so in having children myself, I know how debilitating it can be when children feel singled out, when they get negative attention, which sets them back. So when you keep kids out of school, when you give them negative attention, when they can't concentrate, when they feel different from their peers, they don't perform, they don't learn, they fall back, they stop coming to school, they can't understand it, they can't read, they can't write, they're too proud to say otherwise. Some schools pass them anyway, and then they drop out. And then they drop out without a chance, without a GED, without the skills they need. They're never going to college, they're not going to learn a skill. They don't have maybe a great deal of parental oversight, and so the prison system is going to get them. The criminal justice system will find them. And so I created an effort to create a partnership with juvenile judges and communities. So bringing in the truant officers, bringing in probation, bringing in the school district, bringing in the Department of Mental Health, sitting at round tables just like this, bringing 32 voluntary school districts together. We got funding to bring them all to Anaheim. We sat them down. They had never met each other before. They were at odds with each other's work. And I said, I don't know what a probation officer for a juvenile does, and I don't know what community health does. But I will say, we're going to act as a convener. We're going to bring you together. Let's each county here come up with an action plan. Let's all take each other's phone numbers. Let's work on keeping kids in school. Let's work on any tools we can bring to the table for you. Let's keep in touch. Let's make an effort to keep kids in school. And so now we're up and running for many years. We have some terrific partnerships. We see fewer suspensions statewide in California. We have involved judges. We have involved teachers and administrators. We have involved truant officers, all with the understanding that if you keep kids out of school, you are denying them an opportunity for living in the future. So it was really an initiative of affection, and I'm really grateful for the people who are doing good work here.
What is the power of democracy? Tell us how it started and what it does.
Well, again, this is an outgrowth of civics, and so we already have a K-12 initiative, and it's all staffed by volunteers and grant money. And same with Keeping Kids in School is all volunteers and a few employees from our administration. So now I felt like I have exhausted my employees, but we still need adult civics education because California is unique. We are a majority minority state, and we have a lot of immigrants who don't come from functioning democracies. And so these adults are learning civics through their kids, if they're learning it at all. So I turned to the nonprofit world and asked some lawyers and judges and business people to get together and create a civics program for adults. And that's what the Foundation for Democracy and Justice is. It is civics education for adults. One of our members is the California Chamber of Commerce president who has an interest in seeing his employees educated. Labor's interested because they want their employees educated. We have a law professor, we have lawyers, and we're working on programs for adults.
We have about, oh, please.
You now come to the end of that portion, and I'd like to thank you very much for those great questions, and for the Madam Chief Justice. We laud your courageous positions and are very fortunate to have you in the judicial system here in California. We have a few more minutes, and would you mind taking questions from the audience? Terrific. So we're going to open up questions to all of you for the Madam Chief Justice, and I believe there's microphones out there. It's our opportunity to really dig deeper and show her what we can really do in terms of being inquisitive. So, not to put you on the spot. So do we have any questions out there?
Thank you, Jim. There's currently legislation proposed in California to help kids determine between fake news and real news. And in talking about civics education, it does seem to be important with kids going to BuzzFeed and other places to get them to the point where when they graduate from high school, they're able to consume information that's useful to become a good citizen. How can that be part of the initiative that Power Democracy or any other initiatives you're working on?
I think that's a terrific question, and I would say this. I think the beauty of having a newspaper article is to be able to bring and teach critical thinking. Because the only way, I think, in many respects, that a person's going to be able to discern fake news is to ask questions about it. Ask questions about the source, ask questions about the facts, determine whether they're even plausible. And so what I like about what we do is our civics program doesn't denote a model. It asks educators to come up with a model, and they submit it to us, we put it on our website, and we award it if we think it's substantive and it's replicable. So we especially appreciate those that have students do the research and present a project that required them to rely on facts and news sources that can, in fact, be corroborated. So what we're trying to do is teach thinking. I mean, the truth is, my kids went to school, and for the first 7 years, all they were good at was memorizing, really good at memorizing. But when it came to asking questions about why they thought what they did and what was the basis for their thought and how they could prove it, that's critical thinking, and that's what I think is going to really help serve us in determining fake news from alt news or from true news, facts. And we emphasize that if we can, because of course we're lawyer heavy, and lawyer heavy is very critical about our facts and our thinking. Thank you.
One of the stories that's been in our press over the last year, 2 or 3 years, has been the failure of your computer system to link up the courts in California. And I know your introduction talked about that, and that apparently is one of your initiatives to correct that. I think one of the reasons that funding has been a problem for the courts is that people were aware of apparently a lot of waste that came from that computer link-up system. What are you really doing about that, and are the courts better linked up now? And have you got a computer system that works, that ties it together?
So what you're talking about is the California system called CCMS. CCMS was a computer system that promised to link up all law enforcement entities, all superior courts, all courts of appeal, and the Supreme Court, and public access. So think of it as a great, big, huge, wide diameter, fat, white pipe running through California from tip to tip, that contained all law enforcement information, contained all of the case filings, contained all case dispositions. And mind you, this concept, which was visionary, was created back in, I was still a trial court judge at the time. CCMS was the brainchild of the judicial branch. But you understand that the reason CCMS came about is because every chief would go to the governor and say, I need money for a computer system in 4 counties. The next year, the chief would go in and say, I need more money for a computer system in 6 counties. And finally, one of the governors said, stop it with all of these computer systems in all these counties. Find me something that takes care of the entire problem. And so the judicial branch began to work on it. And they worked on it with judges, and they worked on it with lawyers and court executive officers who said, let's build something off the shelf, because this is something that's never been done. Let's build it ourselves. And we're going to make it iterative. We're going to work on it, and it's not going to be your traditional contract. We're going to work on it. So it took years to put together, and by the time I became chief in 2011, it was done. And we had done audits of it and realized that though it cost about $300 million to build, it would save at a minimum $30 million a year. But at that time, when it finally came into fruition in 2011, when I became chief, I went to the legislature and they said, we have no money to deploy it. And so I said, we've built a Maserati, but we don't have money for gas. That's what it was. And so we said, oh, please, just let us buy a liter or two of gas so we can run our Maserati in San Luis Obispo and these other counties that were waiting for the CCMS system. And the legislature said, no, we can't spend $1 today to save $5 tomorrow. Kill it. And they put it in legislation for us not to spend a single penny more on CCMS. So by the time I became chief, I had a Maserati developed in the garage. I had no money for gas, nothing for insurance, but I was rich in criticism over the CCMS system. And so then, of course, people wanted to buy it. Well, if this is software that we put blood, sweat, and tears in, and by the time they wanted to buy it, it was old. Because, as you know, by the time you unwrap your Dell and figure out how to work it, there's a new one on the market. So what I did is, after being told to kill it, I said, now I want every court to come up with a computer system that it can access e-filing and that can have the capability of linking to each other. Why? Because I want to know, for example, how many robberies were filed in the state of California in 2015. The legislature wants to know how many traffic tickets were filed in 2016 for red light violations. We have no way to get this unless I go to every county, all 58 of them, and say, give me your material so I can submit it. Now they can. Now just about every county has a new computer system that allows e-filing, that can connect up to each other, or they can certainly now retrieve information. The Supreme Court is going to come onto an e-filing system this summer in 2017. We're the last to come on because why? We have death penalty cases. No one else has death penalty cases, and no one else knows how to make those 1,000 and those 10,000 page transcripts searchable. So we're coming on for that. We're in a better place now, but I will tell you, it's not the Maserati. It's more like Volkswagens. We've got a whole bunch of Volkswagens. But they still do the job. We're trying to improve it. We're trying to link them. And because we know this, our funding depends on part on proving our data. So we're working on technology. We're also trying to make video remote interpreting available. We're trying to now, in fact, I just asked now council to approach this, traffic online completely. So you only come in to deal with a traffic matter if you want to deal with it in person. Otherwise, everything can be done from your kitchen table on your watch. That's what we're trying to accomplish now, because that's what the new generation of users will demand, access electronically, remote access. So I am very sorry to have actually hammered the final nails in the CCMS system. I will tell you, I did it under duress because I was threatened with no more money and kill it. And so we lost out on that deal. We lost money on that deal. And now we're trying to make the best that we can with it. But it was a huge concept. It was a visionary idea. It took too long to create. If they'd finished it before we went into recession, we'd have been in a different place. But we just weren't. So we're not in a place where we can provide as much, but we're trying to provide more open meetings, live web streaming, our Court of Appeal cases and our Supreme Court cases. We're trying to make access in other ways until we're able to better fit and give access to the public.
I think we have time for one more question if there is one out there. Okay, well then, thank you very much again. Fabulous, fabulous.